Welcome back to another week of the TRG seminar series. We're happy to see everybody back here again for another week. This week is the penultimate week of the seminar series, and we do not know if there will be another season, if there is another pandemic in our future. Hopefully not. So I'm glad that you've all joined us today or watching the recording to hear from another very talented and this week very experienced set of speakers. And we very much appreciate you supporting us through all of these weeks. And we are excited to get our Wednesday afternoon and mornings back respectively. But without further delay, I'm going to pass the conversation over to my co-host, Sally Gainsbury, who will introduce this week's speakers. Sally.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and welcome back to the Technology, Risk and Gambling Seminar Series, everybody. I'm Associate Professor Sally Gainsbury. I'm Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney and leader of the Technology Addiction Team in the Brain and Mind Centre, which is hosting this webinar series. So today I'm very excited to bring to you two highly experienced speakers and good personal friends who I've been able to cajole into joining us. They both have well and truly enough on their plates and have very generously given up their time to be involved in this series after much pestering. So thank you to both of you. So today we are going to be talking about how to respond to identified gambling harms. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have this topic, we have spoken over the series about how to detect harms and using algorithms and risk detection practices. But when I was speaking to different organizations, including gambling venues and the financial industry, the question that arose repeatedly was, what do we do when we identify someone at risk of harms? We all have a pretty good understanding if someone is identified as a potential having a gambling problem, that we follow self-exclusion, we refer to treatment. But this is going to be into this murkier area of the at-risk, where the problem might be less severe or it might be less identified, it might be less acknowledged. And what is the duty of care? What is the response? How do organizations, whether they're the gambling operator or a social service organization or a financial institution, how do they respond? So, two expert speakers, I'm delighted to introduce Janine Robinson, joining us from Toronto in lockdown. Thank you, Janine. She has just such a wealth of experience, a background in education, clinical care and community development. Janine is now Director at the Centre for Advancement of Best Practice and Managing Director of RG Plus at the Responsible Gambling Council in Toronto, and really focuses on bringing that background in education and the real 360 view of all the different stakeholders involved in the field. And Professor Alex Blaszczynski, or Emeritus Professor at the University of Sydney, who has most famously co-developed the Pathways model, which I'm sure that many people are highly familiar with, and contributed to so many areas in the gambling field, particularly in terms of responsible gambling treatment and the conceptualization of gambling problems that would be way too numerous to go into all the details. But needless to say, the three of us have known each other for quite some time, and I have encouraged as conversational as possible. So if these two interrupt me the whole time, that's just fine. But what I want to do after welcoming both of you is potentially to start with you, Alex, to kick us off by talking about, that we know a lot about problem gambling, but when it gets to that at-risk area, do we know enough to be able to identify and respond to people who are at risk of developing harms?
Thanks, Sally. Thanks for that introduction. More than generous. Look, it's an important and a very complex area because what you're looking at effectively is the capacity to identify indicators of at-risk behavior, which means that we need to define clearly what we mean by at-risk, knowing that not everybody who exhibits some of the early indicators will necessarily go on to develop the problems. The second issue then is in terms of venue operators or family members or others identifying the potential for a person to develop problem gambling is the autonomy and the consent for the individual to actually respond and do something about it. And I think this is part of the complexity of it. And some of the good examples are now, I think, with the COVID-19, where you have quite different models in terms of the Americans, which have a more liberal view that they have civil rights, they have the capacity and the right to congregate despite the fact that there may be a risk involved. So their primary approach is a liberal one, where autonomy and consent sort of form the primary issues. In other jurisdictions, it's more of a collective approach where the community agrees that there are high risks involved in terms of congregating, and therefore are more likely to accept the fact of lockdowns and other approaches. Then we have the issue of vaccination, that whilst the government and other authorities can impose restrictions on people's movements, requirements to wear masks, etc., there's still the role of autonomy and consent in terms of whether or not people want to take a vaccine. And I think this is mimicked in many respects in gambling, where one can identify a potential person at risk, but then there are limitations in terms of how you can impose action or restrictions and motivate that person to actually follow particular rules. This is quite often seen in alcohol and other addictions, where with family members, they identify the individual having a problem, but yet have extreme difficulty in persuading that person to take the necessary actions to achieve help. So I think things like staff training, indicators, greater refinement in terms of defining what we mean, criteria, etc., defining risk. We still have the difficulty of trying to persuade people to follow a course of action which is in their best interest. And again, behavioral economics and nudging may be some of the factors that contribute to that.
Definitely. And I think that really outlines some of the issues. Janine, you've been training such a host of different organizations and people in different roles. Has there been much focus on detection of at risk from a prevention point of view? And do we know enough to be able to train people in how to understand and identify someone that's at risk, but not necessarily with all the full indicators of gambling problems?
Sure. I think we, thank you, Sally. Yeah, I think we do. And thanks, Alex, for your opening soliloquy. It was very smart and very provocative, especially around the issues related to a sort of humans making rational decisions in rational self-interest. I'm going to poke some holes maybe, or poke at that a little bit, not some holes in it, but poke at it a little bit, because I think we need to change a bit of the discussion around risk and problem gambling, and because you need to be, I think you need to have certain level of clinical qualification to accurately identify risk, or you need a really good algorithm, which some online operators, for example, might have. What, in terms of public health, so looking at gambling and public health, I think you can identify at a pretty broad base level which priority populations warrant extra attention in terms of preventing harms related to gambling. So in Canada, for example, in Ontario, we've done a great deal of work for several years in a region of Northwestern Ontario that has many First Nations, a lot of issues related to social determinants of health, gambling expansion, intergenerational trauma, high levels of addiction, and mental health problems. So from a public health perspective, we know that there are at-risk populations for all kinds of addictive behaviors, mental health problems. And so you can identify that population of people quite well, and some of the same people who are at risk for gambling harms are also at risk for other harms. So I think from a public health perspective, we can identify pretty well where those people are. And I think what we've failed at pretty resoundingly in the field is actually having meaningful programming to address the needs of people before they develop serious problems and before they experience serious harms. So a lot of the work I'm doing in the last few years of my life, and especially at the Responsible Gambling Council, is looking at high risk areas of activity, high risk populations based on some of the variables I just described, and really focusing behavioral messages that people can use to ameliorate some of the potential dangers or harms that could be associated with all kinds of activities. And I think another thing when we're talking about risk and we're talking about gambling is we talk about gambling in isolation often, as opposed to everyone on this call understands that gambling is bundled with other behaviors, often other behaviors that cause harms to people and their families and to communities. And I think that when we're trying to approach people who are the people we're concerned about, that we really need to bundle our messages in a way that resonates for what it is they need. So one of the things I often hear myself saying to operators is, people who are using your products, they don't have to have gambling problems to have problems related to their gambling, right? You don't have to have a drinking problem to have had a problem related to your alcohol consumption. I think probably most people on this call have at some point or other maybe had a hangover. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a disordered drinker, right? So I think we need to focus the conversation more broadly and focus on specific impacts and behaviors that people can change. And so get the information much earlier on than the point of somebody's gambling and they're self-excluding, right? By that point, I think we've missed an opportunity to really support people from developing the problems. So I think I'm getting a bit of a call to action for us to really think about high risk populations based on some of the variables I just described, and really start looking at how can we make meaningful how can we provide meaningful health advice to people that they can use in ways that are valuable to them at that level. So Professor Blaszczynski might have something to say about people not being rationally self-interested, which I would agree with too, but go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, look, I think many of the points you raised are quite valid, but I would shift away from the sort of notion of warning messages, behavioral sort of advice, education campaigns that target the individual. I think that there are at a much broader level in terms of accountability by governments and industry, in terms of ensuring that there's a corporate responsible balance between marketing a commercial business that is legalized by the government, by legislation, to ensure that what they put in place is consumer protection measures, and to look at things that actually promote excessive gambling behavior, such as inducements, bonus bets, excessive advertising, exposure of gambling to young kids, and that looks at the conversion between video games and gambling behaviors as well. And I think we need to look at the notion of accountability, and the government itself is accountable for determining what the gambling environment looks like, and that there are quite clear political concerns that they have to measure in terms of unemployment, some of the arguments that there would be massive unemployment, the taxation revenue, and the benefits that governments receive. At the same time, the industry has to measure between appropriate marketing and promoting a commercial activity against exploiting and targeting particular vulnerable individuals. So I think we need to go beyond just looking at public health measures that provide education and the focus on individuals, to actually switching the focus to governments, looking at the availability, distribution, forms of gambling that are available easily to the community. We then need to look at financial institutions and what role they have in terms of transfers of money, making it easier for people to actually access funds, etc. So I think it's that sort of complexity between conflicts of interest across the broad range of stakeholders. And that ranges from the community. We know that some community people do enjoy gambling. They want gambling to continue. Others find it sort of a negative, wasteful activity and should be banned or prohibited or certainly restricted. And I think what we're looking at is a balance between consumer protection, restrictive processes, and autonomy, consent for people to engage in activities that they so choose without harming others.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more, Alex, around the consumer protection elements, and that there needs to be meaningful mechanisms that are measurable to be able to provide gambling in the safest manner possible. So there's a duty of care on the operators and on governments and regulators for sure. When I'm talking about the public health announcements, though, I think that or public health more broadly, one of the things that I wasn't thinking so much about targeting individual people, but thinking about our messaging broadly has been very much, in most jurisdictions I've worked in, it's been very much stigmatizing. I think it's and one of the theories that I have about that is the extreme focus on problem gambling or disordered gambling that we've had in this field has actually contributed to a stigmatization of using responsible gambling practices or safer gambling strategies or positive play strategies, because people who use those strategies say to themselves, or people who, if you recommend a positive play strategy around limit setting, or for example, people will say, well, why do I have to do that? I don't have a gambling problem. Are you saying I have a gambling problem? But if we make the same analogy with alcohol consumption, if I leave my car at home because I'm going to go to the bar tonight and have several drinks, nobody says to me, you left your car at home because you have a drinking problem. They say, good that you left your car at home. Can I buy you a drink? It's a very different cultural discussion around that. And I think we need to show a little more creativity in how to create our messaging around behaviors people can use that are meaningful to them, so they can control and enjoy their gambling, so they can do it with a bit of a safety net around them. So when I'm thinking about public health, I'm thinking about something that I haven't actually seen materialized in any jurisdictions yet. I think we still are not there. If our message is, if you have a gambling problem, call 911 or call 111 or 000, I think we've missed the mark, and I think we've actually missed many opportunities to do early intervention. We're focusing too far downstream. So you and I are in agreement for sure around the safeguards and the consumer protection.
So maybe we can explore that a little bit more, because I completely agree with you, Janine. I mean, I think prevention is so much more impactful if we can stop someone from experiencing those critical, severe gambling problems that are harming themselves and people around them. It's also not great for a sustainable business. It's not great for the community. Like it's prevention problems have so many benefits. But the tricky part is, what do you do? I mean, I think you're right. Like, current strategies are messages and public health campaigns that are really geared at either understanding the risks or problem gambling. There's nothing in the middle. So, maybe Alex, what can we actually do? What are the strategies if you were to identify, or someone was to self-identify, if somehow we were able to say you're at risk, what are the strategies that someone can implement, whether it's doing like a low intensity online psychoeducation or motivational interviewing, or setting a deposit limit, viewing activity statements? What can we actually recommend for the prevention of problems that's going to disrupt that journey from at-risk trajectory towards greater harms?
I think I fully agree with Janine when Janine raises the issue of the focus on the extreme end of problem gambling, and this does not resonate with people at the lower end of regular gamblers or heavy gamblers that aren't necessarily experiencing severe problems such as divorce, domestic violence, suicidality, and so forth. And so an example of that is in some of the earlier educational campaigns in the media, where you had people sort of filling up their shopping basket and then going off to the cashier and then finding that there's no money left in their credit accounts or their debit accounts. It gave the notion that this is something which doesn't resonate with majority of gamblers. It's the same with the Grim Reaper type of approaches, which scare the hell out of people, but it doesn't resonate with them. They say, look, this is a different population to me, it doesn't apply. And I think what we need to do effectively is to start shifting towards the concept that people can use a variety of different tools, budget management tools, encouragement, motivational interviewing, facilities, but importantly, a cultural shift towards the notion that, like drink driving, it is sensible to do these particular elements. It's a positive thing to do. It demonstrates some degree of strength or courage, rather than always focusing on the negative side of things.
Right.
And I think that cultural shift is, I think, very important, because you're not going to get changes in behaviors until you shift that particular attitudes. And sometimes legislation is required to do that. So the prime example there, of course, is smoking and also wearing seatbelts, where initially the introduction of seatbelts was resisted on the basis that, in an accident, people might be trapped. But with legislation, everybody now accepts it. No one questions it. In fact, if you don't wear seatbelts, you elicit the opposite reaction. And I think the same needs to be done with gambling. Yeah. It's an activity that the majority of people enjoy. Some people regard it as a wasteful activity. There are value judgments involved. But the core issue is, if you are going to engage in it, you do it safely. You do it with budget management tools. You do it within appropriate limits.
Right. I think we've really missed the mark on describing those strategies in a way that resonates with people. So I agree about the Grim Reaper comment, Alex, that if you ask us, so my background has been in treatment for many years, and now I'm focusing on prevention. And so I worked with many people who met all of the diagnostic criteria for pathological or disordered, depending on the time, gambling. And if you ask those people what would have stopped them, they would have said nothing would have stopped me, if you ask them that. And then if you say what messages would be effective, they say, give us the Grim Reaper message, give us but these are people, these are people at this really extreme end of harms, suffering acute and chronic problems that are not reflective of the majority of the population. So the majority of the population who experiences some harms from gambling, whether it be loss or irritation or frustration or just I wasted my time, whatever it is, there are harms to lesser and greater degrees, of course. What is the benefit? What is the net positive benefit of me using strategies, safer play strategies? So the seatbelt analogy, why would I put it on? Is so not only so that I'm safe, so that I'm comfortable. If I use gambling budgeting tools, for example, as someone who's a recreational gambler, I can enjoy my time playing in a venue without having to think all the time, how much have I spent? How much is in my wallet? Am I in trouble when I get home? What am I going to tell the wife? What am I going to la 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 la, right? You don't have to go through all of that in your head. You can just relax into the activity. Exactly the same as my analogy of leaving the car at home when I'm drinking. Right? I don't have to think, how much alcohol have I had? Have I had food? What time is it? What's my blood alcohol level? So, but we haven't communicated to people who gamble the value of that. We've described it as being responsible or as being, fill in the blank, X, Y, and Z, but we haven't described the value to them. The value is you can control, you've got a control in place and you can just relax into it and you don't have to worry about all this other stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree, Janine. I often talk about what we've learned from what used to be mobile bill shock. And it was a real phenomenon that people were getting their mobile or their cell phone bill at the end of the month and freaking out because they had no idea how much they were spending. And that led, at least in some jurisdictions, to strict regulation that you had to notify people when they were approaching their balance. And people were actually self-selecting plans, and companies were starting to provide unlimited plans. So you could say, I'm going to spend, this X amount of dollars, and I know that I'm not going to reach that because I'm happy to send that amount. I'm going to be notified if I'm spending over it. And that allowed people to surf and do everything they wanted online. engage in whatever they wanted, or to a lower extent, they could, if you wanted to have a $20 plan where you would use it up within 2 days or send a couple of text messages and that was it, you could pitch what was correct for you. And that's the analogy I often use. But interestingly enough, the research I was just reading this week from the behavioural, the BI team in the UK, and they were looking at how to encourage people to take the vaccine. And so they looked at all these different strategies, and the one that found was most effective was the benefits of having the vaccine for other people. So emphasizing that you are taking, similar to what we use in driving a lot, it's about thinking about the community and harms for others. And if we can think about, is there something within gambling we can think about, set yourself a limit, for your family or for the community, or even the fact that when I've tested strategies that have been more on the annoying side, arguably, so pop-up messages, things that come up on screens, the main reason people didn't find them annoying is because what you were saying at the very beginning, they felt they were helpful for other people, and they recognized that I don't have a problem, but some people in this venue do, and I'm willing for this pop-up message. I'm willing to set a limit, because if that then normalizes this behavior, if that makes someone else safer, I'm happy to do that. So potentially that's another avenue that could be explored, is encouraging that sort of social and group morality of normalizing engagement with consumer protection tools and highlighting the preventative effects and the ripples that have throughout the venue, your family, your immediate community and beyond. I'm not sure what you guys think, or if gambling is potentially much just inherently selfish because it's all about money and personal gain. It is, for all socialization, somewhat of a solitary individual activity.
Well, what I would argue, Sally, would be that it's quite correct that people don't need budget management tools at the lower end of gambling, the recreational gambler. The same with the mobile phone user. They were able to maintain their activities within affordable limits. But you have that particular proportion of individuals that, for a variety of reasons, engage in those particular behaviors to excess, and it's shifting that particular sort of cultural perspective for that particular group. So you need to target those particular individuals to prevent them from sort of continuing on. In terms of the analogy, I can just play the devil's advocate. If we look at the cultural context of the benefits of vaccine for others, we know that social distancing, wearing masks, was highly beneficial to protecting the community against the spread of COVID virus. Yet within America, we found that a proportion of, in fact, a large minority of individuals overrode that by reference to civil liberties and their right to attend large groups. And that, we saw that in evidence with Donald Trump holding rallies, mass rallies, not wearing masks, irrespective of the scientific evidence that would indicate that these were beneficial for the community at large. And so this is where I think the cultural shift needs to be emphasized in terms of saying that these are in fact unacceptable behaviors. Excessive gambling is detrimental. As a clinician, having treated substantial numbers of patients, we see that there are a broad range of reasons why people lose control. And we need to ensure that we make it much easier for people to follow the track of seeking help rather than stigmatizing them and sort of making it more difficult and putting barriers in place. I'm not sure what your comments to that are, Janine.
Well, I was thinking as Sally was describing that research, that I've certainly found in my work in prevention and awareness that the impact on others is very culturally fluid. So and it's not every culture is individualistic, the way some of the American culture, some of the American behaviors you're describing, and not all are more collective. But I certainly find for people who identify as part of a collective culture more broadly, that those strategies always have been important in addressing gambling issues, and especially in messages around help seeking, that for Indigenous communities, for example, pretty much everywhere I know that a message wouldn't be like, are you spending more than you can afford? The message that might resonate would be, are you having fights with your family? Is gambling causing discord in your family? And the family unit and the impact of gambling on the family would be much more significant driver of change or of seeking help than the financial part. And again, I don't think we've shown great creativity and nuance in our messaging. And we use this sort of blanket messaging, financial harms, relationship harms, time and money, but that's not always the right approach. So that what you're both describing, I think there's a lot of inroads that can be made around the impact of gambling on families, not just on the money, but on the role of the person who's gambling and what has happened in their family as a result of their gambling behavior, the gambling involvement, the time away, the discord, the distrust, the fighting, the humbugging, whatever it is.
And I think maybe I want to shift a little bit back to maybe my original question following this conversation. I'm wondering if we can accurately identify people who are at risk, who do need, so as you say, Alex, not the people who probably are happy to stay in control of their gambling or just gamble such low levels that it doesn't have any harm, and moving away from the notion of harm at this, PGSI +1, or you have reduced spending money. I mean, I think that's a little silly. If you go to the movies, you have less spending money, but what level, how accurately can we identify when someone tips into what we would classify, we're using this kind of term, at risk, so on the trajectory towards problem gambling, not experiencing severe, disruption or discord, as you say, Janine, acknowledging that you just have a hangover every now and again. So, but what's the difference between I'm fine, I just get hangovers every now and again, and I'm actually at risk? Or if it's not the individual self-identifying, which we know is much less likely to occur, can venues or financial organizations meaningfully use the PGSI or the gambling effect measure or an algorithm to detect someone who is experiencing risk to the extent that it might be on a trajectory and they need an intervention? Can we do that?
I would, Sally, I would argue that we can dichotomize it into the financial institutions, the gaming operators, etc., and family members and friends. The family members and friends are able, I think, more accurately to identify someone who is at potential risk. And the reason for that is obviously that they're more in tune with their particular behavior, they're more aware of their spending. Granted that quite a number of gamblers do conceal their problems from family members, but by and large, it's those particular individuals that at best to detect people who are at risk or starting to go on the trajectory of developing a particular problem. And in my view, that there's been insufficient attention directed towards supporting these individuals to provide them with resources to try to encourage the problem gambler to accept the fact that they may have problems, or they need to shift their particular behavior to maintain sort of sustainable gambling in the long term, to enjoy it in the long term, etc. And then with the industry and financial institutions, I think the financial institutions are well placed to identify problem gambling because they have the potential to match up merchant codes from gambling providers with a person's overall financial situation and determine whether or not they can afford to gamble at that particular level or not. There are ethical issues as to whether you then move on to the extent of gambling, then alcohol, then pornography use, fast food, etc., etc. But that's a separate issue. The gaming industry, I think, there you're looking at the use of loyalty cards, objective data, and refining algorithms to identify people that might be on a trajectory to problem gambling. The difficulties with cash-based gambling, and their industry staff need to monitor those particular behaviors over a period of time, because it becomes extremely difficult in a one-off session to identify whether the person has saved up a lot of money with the intent to gamble and then disappears but doesn't have a problem, as compared to someone who repeatedly comes in expending smaller amounts of money but developing problems in the long term. So I think, you know, the focus has been on financial institutions and the industry, but I think we've neglected the family members and friends to provide them with resources to encourage people to seek help.
Interesting. I agree. I agree with the role in some places, like in Canada, the financial sector is not involved in these any prevention sort of strategies. Credit counseling in Ontario, for example, has engaged in doing training and referral, so they can sort of learn to how to screen if somebody's credit and debt situation is just not adding up, how to screen for gambling related financial harms, and how to make do a brief intervention and make a referral to treatment. And so that's quite compelling, but that again is putting the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So thinking about online operators, for example, you know, the algorithms, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the online space to do things without worrying about the human dynamics of offending someone or being shy or timid or saying the wrong thing. I mean, there's something paradoxically delightful, I think, about the online space that frees you up from some of those human tensions. But more broadly, I'm gonna play devil's advocate and take Alex's role for a second. Is how important is it to identify risk? Is that really what we should be looking for? Should we be looking for risk, or should we be looking at specific behaviors and harms and addressing those individually? Just, you know, a question. So because again, I have a clinical background, Alex has a clinical background, right? So we might have some information on which to decide objectively whether somebody meets some criteria for having risk for greater harms. But the general population.
This comes back, I think, Janine, to what I mentioned earlier on, the piece of having a defined definition of what we mean by risk. You talk about risk and then talk about behaviors. Well, the behaviors are the risk. They're the indicators of risk. Then you have instruments like the PGSI that purport to look at behaviors or reactions, feeling guilty and so forth. Do they actually necessarily represent risk? And there are some risk factors, for example, being male, being impulsive. Impulsivity may be modifiable, but male gender is not generally modifiable. So that there are modifiable risk factors, there are non-modifiable risk factors, and we need to work out what we actually mean by risk and what factors actually increase the likelihood or probability of a person developing a particular problem. And I think at the moment we just talk about someone being at risk. I mean, as soon as you start gambling, you're at risk. As soon as you start drinking, you're at risk. If you start smoking, you're at risk. If you get into the car, you're at risk. If you go to a sporting event or sporting activity, you're at risk for injuries, etc. So what do we actually mean by at risk? And what do we mean by someone who is vulnerable? Because setting aside children and people with mental health issues, you're looking at sort of everybody being at risk. So is it a useful concept? Or right. Should we start looking at identifying what are the clear behaviors that are the early indicators of a exactly. Person heading down the wrong trajectory? And that is exactly. Increasing levels of gambling, etc. Sorry, Janine.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, part of what I am concerned about is for the 98% of people in the population who are not clinically trained, what is it they need to know to be effective to support, encourage someone who is at risk? And so most people do not have the skills. And you know, a big part of what I do in my work with training is using the skill sets and the foundational knowledge that people have in their field in their field, in their disciplinary, in their field, whatever it is. It could be customer service, it could be banking, whatever, to identify behaviors in context of what it is they know. I'm thinking more that we need to be focusing on the behaviors and in context with what someone who works in that field ought to know. So if I work in the banking sector, so for example, I went to I have a financial advisor, not because I have money, but because I go to a credit union and they just give you that, even if you don't have any money. They just, this part of the service because it's community-based finance. And my guy, Jason, he looks through my financial transactions, and because I travel a lot with work, or at least I did, and a lot of the places I would go to would be casinos. And so therefore, if I was in Australia, I would be at the Sydney casino withdrawing money because that's where I was and I needed cash. So I have all these withdrawals from lots of casinos. And he's looking, he's like, he got some interesting transactions there, and he was just teasing me. And I didn't have a flag because I wasn't in deficit. I wasn't, there wasn't any kind of behavior on that. But he is someone who has the skills, knowledge, and opportunity to identify when someone is having harms related to financial spend. My credit card, American Express, will call me if I spend an inordinate amount on something that's out of character. I'll get a call within 5 minutes asking or they'll decline the transaction and call me and say, "Is this really you?" So that's about the behavior. So they don't have to be trained to be clinicians treating people with mental health or addictions, but they use the skills and knowledge they have based on good information around what the behavior is and respond to the behavior.
Yeah, but I think to take your analogy about the bank, certainly the first time I purchased airline tickets on American Express, they rang me up to verify it was myself. Once the pattern of behavior established, I can spend up to $20,000 on business class airfares, and American Express wouldn't contact me. The key issue, I think, is, and you're quite correct, that people are capable of identifying indicators or behaviors of a particular issue. I think the challenge is to convince that person, persuade that person, motivate that person to actually respond to that particular message. And that, I think, is where the nexus is, that you can actually identify, staff members. I've spoken with croupiers, I've spoken with a number of others, and they say, yeah, we can identify problem gamblers. I've been to casinos for research purposes. I've looked at people and I thought, these are people I think that could have a gambling problem by way of which they're gambling, the pattern of expenditure, etc. But what am I going to do? I'm going to go up there and tell them to stop, in which case I'll probably be assaulted or abused. The croupier is in the same position, suggesting, well, you're perhaps gambling too much. So they need to be trained, I think, in dealing with those, developing the particular skills to deal with difficult customers. But the real challenge, I think, is to persuade someone that they need to do something about their particular behavior, having identified the behavioral signs.
Right, agreed. And it's, this is where I think the tension between duty of care and individual liberty and autonomy meet, right? So you can provide someone with options if they're demonstrating behavior in a casino, for example, and they may tell you to bugger off, but you've done your duty of care and morally as well as legally to respond appropriately with the information or the offer, whatever it is. But you can't make someone want to do something different. So that's for sure. But I think often what happens is that people aren't getting the information that they require at the right point in time. So this has something to do with also the like where the person is at. So an example from my own life as somebody who smoked cigarettes historically, and I was powerfully addicted to cigarettes. I wanted to quit so badly and I just couldn't. I was really, really wicked dependence on my cigarettes. And the government started putting out educational materials around how harmful cigarettes are. And my packet said, secondhand smoke kills. And as I was taking a nice long drag off my cigarette, I'd say, I'm glad I'm smoking it firsthand. because it was the wrong information. You were
Yeah.
trying to change a behavior with information, as though I didn't know smoking would kill me. And people who are gambling, as though they don't know they're in difficulties, people who are gambling at highly harmful levels, they know that they're gambling at highly harmful levels. Telling them, giving them information is not what is required at that point in time. It's a miss. So, you know, when I'm thinking about, like, for the clinicians who are here, that sort of using cognitive behavioral is, you know, the cognitive stuff is really important for prevention, for youth prevention programs, helping people understand, when I embark on this activity, these are the risks, this is what I can do. But once somebody's in it and they're really in it, it's about the behavior. You can't reason people out of a gambling problem at a craps table. You just can't. It's not the place to do it. But you also have to give them information that's useful to them.
But I think that there's an additional element in terms of just the right information at the right time. I think that needs to be coupled with what I would describe as an affective shift. That is, something else comes in which supersedes the importance of their particular activity. With smoking, quite often, not always, but quite often, a black spot on the lung will be an affective shift towards stopping the person from continuing to smoke. The notion that a spouse threatens to leave or divorce if they don't stop their behavior, that may in some cases be sufficient. But there needs to be some affective shift that occurs that is more powerful than the continuation of their particular addictive behavior.
Agreed, 100%. And that cycles back to what I was saying about earlier around having a positive message around what is the value to me of using these strategies, tools, whatever the resource is. If I want to keep my relationship as healthy as possible, it matters to me. I want to be a good parent, fill in the blank, whatever that is. The information about have we successfully in our fields, in the prevention field and awareness field in particular, communicated the value of how good that feels, how good you will feel when you do that. I don't think we have.
And as we're drawing towards the end of the hour, I know you guys weren't sure you could speak for an hour, but I'm pretty sure if I let you run, you could speak for another hour. Maybe I can give you both the opportunity to, what I'd like you to do is issue the challenge. You know, you don't get, well, actually you guys do get this opportunity quite a lot, but to speak directly to, you know, whether it's financial industries or the government or venues, what's the challenge? I think my hesitation here is we've spoken a lot about some of the difficulties, and by no means do I want to underestimate how complex and how difficult this idea of targeting at risk and not defaulting to problems, because I think it can be a bit of a cop-out in my view of like, oh, we don't want to offend someone by suggesting they're problem gamblers. And I don't think anyone here is suggesting that that's what we do. We're talking about non-judgmental approaches, positive messages, empowering people to take steps that are best for them. So setting aside that, I think that misconception or cop-out that, oh, they're not, I don't know for sure if they're problem gamblers, so I don't want to have any conversation or send them an email or potentially offend someone. Moving away from that, what is the challenge? Given the complexities, I don't want the take-home message to be, this is too hard, we won't do it. What could organizations, gambling venues, financial institutions, people who are, you know, friends or family members or those who work in the community, what can we start doing now to try and interrupt the trajectory of people from risky to problematic gambling? Alex, do you want to start?
It's a complex issue. It's quite difficult, but I think the only way to approach it effectively is by integration and collaboration between the key stakeholders. The politics, I think, is important. I think the government plays a crucial role in this. And I make reference to smoking. There are no benefits to smoking, yet the government fails to totally ban smoking. And there are political reasons for that. They'd lose an election potentially with that. There's big business promoting those particular activities. I think the industry needs to work with the government rather than being adversarial. They need to work towards corporate responsibility. and including the financial institutions, where all three need to get together to work out particular approaches. The argument of privacy issue, I think, needs to be overcome. I think there needs to be a greater sharing of information between stakeholders, the industry and financial institutions in terms of determining the source of money and the affordability of money. And I think recent issues in terms of money laundering is going to contribute to that in some measure. But my view is a greater collaborative, integrated approach from all key stakeholders, including the community, is important.
Agreed, completely. So I'm, throwing down a challenge is my specialty. So thanks, Sally. Sally, for letting me go right to my wheelhouse here. So a couple things. So, having a treatment background, I think that from, treatment perspective is really thinking about how we support people in a much more upstream manner in community-based care, as opposed to waiting for people to really lose everything and come into a clinical setting. I think we need to really think about being more nimble around treatment. But additionally, my challenge to industry really is to try something new. I look at the gaming operators who have these incredibly bright, talented people working for them who can pivot the business on a dime. COVID happens, pivot. All of these new ways of operating happen. There's so much ingenuity, and people keep going to drinking from the same well, trying the same thing, and as opposed to really trying to shake out and break into a new, break out the old paradigm into the new paradigm. So my challenge is to innovate and to try a new approach to incentivize people in a meaningful way to use the strategies or the information that you're providing in a way that they understand the benefit to them. And in the industry, there's just so many untapped mental resources, I think, that could be put to this task. How can you, when you have a player sign up for a loyalty card on your website, your gambling sports betting website, how do you incentivize that player to understand the value and benefit of using some of the limit setting tools that are there? How do you talk about it positively and integrate it into their experience in a way that is interesting to them and meaningful? And I think there's been a pretty collective failure to do that. And so, but you're not going to do that by saying I have a self-exclusion program. Like, you need to really try something new. There's lots of us who have some ideas around a new way to program, something new you could try, a new way to message something, and give it a try, evaluate it, see if it works. If it works, scale it up. If it doesn't work, tweak it.
Thank you. I mean, they're fantastic takeaways. And COVID, for me, the silver lining, and I hate to say it, Janine, you're still fully in it and probably not interested in silver linings right now, but it has been interesting to see the pivot of industries that, at least in Australia, all gambling essentially shut down for at least 10 weeks. And that sufficiently motivated gambling venues to completely rethink how they were providing their services. That the threat of you will be closed and you will have a financial loss and it will be a quick decision and will be long lasting, that if you do not prioritize health and safety of employees and patrons, we will shut you down. That if the transformation of the industry and the response and the rethinking and innovation that came, okay, well, we can get this, we've got policies, we've got practices, we're going to change what we're doing. I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if there was a similar level of incentive about safer gambling and preventing, not just responding, but preventing gambling problems, how quickly and how innovatively industry could start to switch up operations in a way that is acceptable to patrons as well. Because I think a lot of the health methods that are out there have been completely acceptable. It's a little bit more hassle maybe to sign in or to, wipe down machines or wait for someone to clean it, but we're happy to do it. I think that patrons are pretty happy to get on board with safer gambling practices. And my other main takeaway from reflecting on what both of you said is to empower everyone who's on this call and who's listening to use your existing skills. That if you work in the banking industry, you know what customers look like. You know what divergent behavioral patterns look like. If you work in the gambling industry, yes, there is a variety and we don't know how affordable something is, but you could ask. You can have conversations. We didn't get too much into staff training, which is totally both of your expertise, but that idea of just talking to every customer, not just people who are at risk. And so using the expertise you have already, not being held back by thinking I'm not an expert in, X, Y, and Z, but I've got skills, I can actually start developing this and to test and innovate and see what works and see how proactive we can be. I think you'll find there's a long way to go before you start offending anybody or even getting too close to it. So that would be my challenge to people, is to not be afraid of upsetting the apple cart or upsetting your manager or upsetting your patrons, because I think we would all be very surprised by how far you can go, particularly with that if you're using that positive messaging of we're doing this for the customer's benefit and for your benefit and for the community's benefit. I think we'd be able to make a lot of innovative changes before we'd come up across any problems. So that's my take-home challenges. But I want to say a huge thank you to Janine and Alex for so generously sharing your time, your absolute wealth of experience and knowledge with us all. Email addresses are easily available online. You guys are on LinkedIn and various other contact points. And when the real world starts again, no doubt you will be headlining the conferences in your rightful places at the podium. But in the meantime, thank you for being behind the webcam and being part of this webinar series that is trying to get content and stimulating conversation out into the world. So huge thank you to you both. Thank you to everyone tuning in live or after the fact. And thanks again to Tom and Khalil and the Brain and Mind Centre for supporting our webinar series. As Khalil mentioned at the outset, this is this penultimate episode. Tune in next week for our last episode of season 2, where we will be talking about consumer data and use of big data sets, and with 2 experts, Matthew Tom from Harvard School of Medicine, who works in the Cambridge Health Alliance, and Chris Percy, who has an expert industry in analysis from an industry perspective. Both of them bring both an academic and sort of business background to how we can look at using consumer data. So do tune in, same time, same place next week. That will be our final episode of season 2. And we hope that if you have found this episode's interesting, please do share it with others. And otherwise, sign off and enjoy your day.